I surprised my cheating wife in the cruelest way imaginable, at the company party, in front of everyone, when I made it clear that I knew everything and that there was nothing left but divorce. I felt the bitter taste of the truth exploding in my throat, but there, with the stares of dozens of faces, including her parents and colleagues, there was no turning back. She still tried to defend herself, a desperate, laughable attempt, making confused and incoherent excuses. "It's not what it looks like, you're exaggerating," were the first words she let out, as panic seeped into her eyes, the same ones I had loved for so long and which were now staring at me full of fear. Only this time, the game was on my side, and for the first time in months, I controlled the board. The previous weeks had been a blur of pain and mistrust, an insane sequence of days in which her trail of lies began to appear before me like the marks of a barely concealed betrayal. They were no longer minor absences, they were lapses, lame excuses, frequent outings and whispered phone calls that she thought I ignored. To anyone else, they might seem like coincidences or even innocent gestures, but to me, who knew her so well, every detail was like a constant drop of poison, feeding my certainty that something was going on behind the calm facade of our marriage. I remember the day I decided it was time to act, to investigate on my own. It was painful and humiliating to search for clues, each discovery more bitter than the last, but I needed to see the naked truth. I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. That's when, at the end of an exhausting night, with my heart pounding between relief and agony, I finally found what I had been dreading: messages exchanged with someone from the company, intimate words, statements she never made to me again. There was her lover, hidden in empty messages that promised everything she had denied me for months. My eyes didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there, cold and glaring. I could have confronted her that very night, ended it right there, but something inside me told me that it wouldn't be enough. It wasn't enough for all the damage she had done, for all the pain she had caused. There was something darker in me, a voice that pushed me not only to put an end to our story, but to do it in a way that she would never forget. And that's when I devised the plan that would culminate in that party. If she had chosen to lie to me, then now she would see what it was like to be exposed by the truth. I prepared like a surgeon before an operation, calmly and precisely. On the day of the event, every detail was in place. She, looking stunning, smiling at her colleagues and friends who were completely unaware of what was about to happen. She thought everything was under control, that I was still ignorant, the silly, conforming husband. When our gazes met in the hall, it was impossible to hold back the contempt that was eating me up inside. And yet I kept my face impassive. When the time was right, I waited until she was the center of attention. A short pause in the conversations, a moment of attention, and I began to speak. "I want to thank you all for being here, but especially my wife, who has given me another reason to celebrate today." I began with a tone that seemed friendly, casual, but soon my voice became cold. With each word I weighed the consequences. I saw the shock spreading through the crowd and realized that each word was a blow, a brick falling from the castle she had built of lies. She, lost and uncomprehending, looked around for support, trying to interrupt me, but I remained relentless, each sentence more charged with a truth that crumbled her. "There's something you don't know," I said with a bitter smile. The silence was total. "I'm asking for a divorce because this woman, who promised me her loyalty, has chosen another man." All eyes turned to her, including those of her parents, who were only a few meters away and could barely process what they were hearing. The look of horror on her face was a sight I would never forget. She tried to speak, to deny it, to shout that it was all a misunderstanding, but her words died in the air. The truth, which she had tried to hide for so long, was now there, raw, between us, and she knew that nothing else would save her. At the end, I threw into the air the last sentence that would destroy any defense she might have tried to build: "And if there are still any doubts, the messages you exchanged with your lover are here, ready for anyone to see." At that moment, the room seemed to breathe, as if everyone had woken up from a trance. She stepped back, her eyes red and full of tears, mumbling apologies that no longer had any value. Her parents stared at her as if they had never met her. Her lover, hidden among the guests, remained silent, but I saw in his eyes that he too knew the mask had fallen. I left the party with a bittersweet feeling of justice. There was no more pain, just a kind of emptiness, a bitter peace that I would never have imagined feeling. What I hadn't expected was that, despite everything, she would still try to save her own image, that she would still try to convince everyone that it was all just a mistake, a momentary glitch. Now, I was determined to go all the way. She would pay for every lie, for every broken promise. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any kind of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they show how betrayal can devastate lives, leaving deep scars and irreversible consequences. Get ready for an impactful narrative that will reveal the secrets, the lies, and the bitter price of disloyalty. Have a good story, and be ready to be shocked. The hall was elegantly decorated, low lights reflecting off the crystal chandelier and the champagne glasses in the guests' hands. The company party had been looked forward to all year, an event where professionals could relax, celebrate their achievements and show off their personal accomplishments. There, at the center of it all, was Thomas, a man with a firm build and a deep gaze, who watched his colleagues with calculated serenity. His discreet but confident style made him respected and, even in silence, his presence was striking. Next to him was Emma, his wife, wearing a sophisticated dress and an impeccable smile, moving with the confidence of someone who knows how to be admired. Thomas and Emma were, at first glance, the ideal couple. Almost a decade into their marriage, they had built a solid life, full of moments that anyone would envy. They met in college, during a chance encounter in a bookstore, where Emma, looking for a book, found Thomas in a lively conversation about literature. He, with his serious manner, intrigued her, she, with her easy smile, charmed him immediately. Soon they were together, building a future based on shared values and the dream of a life together. Over time, their relationship became a mixture of friendship, admiration and deep love, and together they faced all the difficulties and challenges that life presented them with. Emma was an intelligent, perceptive and ambitious woman. In the company, she stood out not only for her competence, but also for her charisma, skillfully managing to balance the demands of work with her commitments at home. She had a magnetic presence that attracted people's attention, and her ability to deal with difficult situations was admirable. Thomas, on the other hand, was a man of rigid values, but endowed with a sensitivity that few people knew. He worked in finance and, unlike Emma, preferred to stay out of the limelight, concentrating on what was essential. For him, his achievements and life with Emma were enough to fill any gap in external recognition. His devotion to Emma was visible in the small daily gestures and the deep respect he had for her. Their marriage seemed perfect, but like all relationships, it had its hidden layers. Thomas, for example, sometimes wondered to what extent he really knew Emma. Although he admired her deeply, there were times when she seemed unattainable, as if she was always one step ahead, maintaining a universe of her own that he could never fully access. He ignored these feelings, convincing himself that they were the result of his own insecurity, something to be put aside for the sake of what they had built together. That year, Thomas and Emma had experienced different challenges. Thomas was facing increasing pressure at work, involved in projects that demanded more and more of his time and concentration. The demands left him mentally exhausted, which gradually led him to withdraw from social activities and even family time. Emma, on the other hand, was at the peak of her career. The new project opportunities and the admiration she received from her colleagues brought a sense of fulfillment that she believed she deserved after years of effort. The difference in their rhythms and interests was beginning to become evident, but they kept up appearances, trying to overcome obstacles with dialogues that didn't always delve into what they both really felt. Despite the difficulties, Thomas maintained a silent hope that everything would work out, and that this phase of distance between them was only a matter of time. He had faith in their routine as a couple, in the traditions they kept and in the daily gestures that he believed were the foundation of their relationship. Emma, on the other hand, as busy as she was with work, tried to balance her time so that her marriage wouldn't be affected. There was a silent guilt in her eyes, as if she knew that her dedication to her work and the admiration she received outside the home sometimes took her attention away from her husband. As Emma greeted a group of colleagues, Thomas watched from afar. The way she moved so naturally among people always made him proud, but now something different was bothering him. He couldn't look away from Emma, who seemed so at home in her surroundings, so at ease, that for a moment he felt like an outsider. Something was out of place, an indefinable sensation that disturbed him, but which he, out of respect and consideration, tried to ignore. She was the center of attention, but he remained on the sidelines, watching in silence. As he approached her, Thomas noticed that Emma, despite her open smile, seemed distant, enveloped in an aura of unease that he couldn't define. Her smile, which had always been spontaneous and genuine, now seemed like a shield. There was something there that he didn't understand, an invisible barrier that kept him away. He didn't like to think about it, he preferred to believe it was an unfounded impression, but the feeling persisted. "Are you all right?" he asked, trying to catch something in her gaze. She just smiled, said yes, and quickly turned the subject to the atmosphere of the party, commenting on how lively the event was and how happy she was to be sharing this moment with him. Her words, however, didn't seem to match Thomas's feelings. He could see the enthusiasm in her words, but something genuine was missing, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Restlessness began to grow, as if every evasive answer from Emma was a signal he couldn't decipher. He tried to fight these thoughts, wishing they were just the result of his own insecurity, but the reality before his eyes didn't help. Instead of reassuring him, her words made him even more suspicious, each gesture seeming to conceal a meaning he couldn't reach. Tension, albeit silent, permeated the air. Thomas alternated between superficial conversations with his colleagues and furtive glances at Emma, who continued to interact with the guests with a lightness that made him wonder if he was being overly paranoid. But her gestures, soft laughter and subtle touches when talking to certain colleagues, ignited a discomfort in him that refused to go away. There was a growing discomfort, a feeling that she was in a world of her own, inaccessible, where he was not invited to enter. The evening wore on and Thomas felt more and more out of place. He tried to join in the conversations, smile and mingle with his colleagues, but his mind was stuck on that feeling, a vague suspicion that he didn't dare turn into words. He wanted to believe that it was all just a mistaken impression, that the lack of connection between them that night was just a consequence of their tiredness and the hectic atmosphere. However, as the evening progressed, the feeling of strangeness only increased. The festive atmosphere, which should have been a time of celebration and relaxation, became a time of unease for Thomas. He tried to focus on his colleagues and the conversations, but his attention kept returning to Emma, the gestures she displayed and the way she seemed to avoid his gaze. He didn't know what to think, but he felt that, somehow, that night would change everything. As the night progressed, Thomas felt more and more disconnected from his surroundings. Even though he chatted to one or other of his colleagues, his attention was focused on Emma, on the small details that had previously gone unnoticed and now seemed to have an unusual weight. He watched her from a distance, trying to understand what was bothering him so much that night. Something was different, the way she moved, the tone of her voice, the excessive glint in her eye. He tried to push the thoughts away, but a disturbing intuition haunted him, growing inside him like a flame that, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, consumed his peace. Every time he approached her, Emma seemed to retreat, always finding an excuse to move away, attend to a colleague or simply disappear among the guests. Thomas tried hard to ignore it, rationalizing that it was a reflection of his own insecurity. Even so, when she seemed to laugh too much at a joke, or chat animatedly with someone, he felt sidelined, an outsider watching his wife from afar, as if she were someone else. The feeling of exclusion ate away at him, and he began to realize that this was yet another symptom of something bigger, a dark omen that something was wrong, far beyond his suspicions and fears. He decided to go outside for a moment to get some air, hoping that the cold night would clear his thoughts. Outside, the biting wind contrasted with the stifling heat of the party. He took a deep breath, trying to clear away the confusion that seemed to cloud his mind. He tried to convince himself that it was all just an exaggeration, but even with all his efforts, doubt persisted, nagging at him like an invisible thorn, pushing him to face what he avoided seeing. On returning to the hall, Thomas realized that Emma was not where he had last seen her. He walked among the groups of colleagues, trying to locate his wife with his eyes, but she seemed to have disappeared. He felt a pang of unease, an unsettling intuition that led him to cross the party towards the far corner of the hall. That's when he spotted, in the distance, Emma talking to another man, her boss. She had a light, almost intimate expression, which he didn't usually see in public. He noticed the way she tilted her face as she listened to him, a disconcerting closeness that didn't seem innocent. Thomas continued to watch in silence, noticing every gesture, every restrained smile. He tried to convince himself that it was just a friendship between work colleagues, but the way she touched the man's arm, as if this were a habitual and comfortable action, disturbed him deeply. He felt a growing pain, a mixture of anger and sadness, seeing that something was slipping through his fingers. He moved a little closer, without them realizing it, to hear fragments of the conversation, and Emma's voice sounded soft, sweet in a way he hadn't heard in a while. The smile on her boss's face confirmed everything he had feared. At that moment, Thomas felt his heart break. What he was observing wasn't just a conversation between colleagues, it was something deeper, a clear sign that there was much more between them than he had imagined. The closeness, the gestures, the tone of voice, everything indicated that Emma no longer belonged to him in the same way. Reality hit him like a punch. The woman he'd thought he'd known and loved for so long was involved in something he couldn't have foreseen, and the realization of it seemed to devastate his soul. Emma, unaware of her husband's presence, remained engrossed in the conversation, laughing at something the man said, while their hands touched discreetly, in a way that revealed intimacy and familiarity. Thomas, immobilized by the shock, felt a kind of nausea, an inexplicable emptiness, as if everything they had built together was crumbling in silence before his eyes. What he saw now wasn't just a physical betrayal, but a breach of trust that destroyed everything he held true between them. However, he still didn't want to accept it. His mind was trying to fight against what his eyes were seeing, looking for explanations, justifications that would ease the unbearable pain. But the image of Emma, so close to that man, with a sparkle in her eyes that he thought was just for him, made him realize that there were not enough excuses for what he was witnessing. She was involved in something he couldn't control, and that realization was like losing his footing. At that moment, Thomas felt the urge to confront them, to demand explanations, but he held back. He decided that he wouldn't let his emotions take over, not yet. He needed a plan, he needed proof that would leave no doubt, something that would show her, once and for all, that he knew everything. This thought made him take a deep breath and step back, keeping his composure, even though his heart was in pieces inside. He spent the rest of the evening watching Emma and her boss, every glance, every movement, mentally capturing everything for the moment when she would finally have to face the truth. The interactions between them were enough evidence that it wasn't just a friendship. There was something more, something that was eating him up inside, but which he still needed to confirm before acting. The wait was agonizing, but he knew that the truth would soon come out. As the clock ticked down, Thomas began to realize that the moment of revelation was near. He could no longer look at Emma without feeling a sharp pain in his chest. Every smile she threw at her lover was like a direct blow to his dignity. His mind swirled with thoughts of how it had all happened, how he had missed so many signs, and how the love of his life, the woman with whom he had shared so many dreams, had betrayed him in such a cruel way. As the party began to wind down, Thomas approached Emma, who finally noticed him and gave him a tense smile, as if she knew something was wrong, but didn't know exactly what. He looked at her deeply, trying to find some trace of the woman he had loved and trusted for so many years. However, all he saw was a stranger, someone who was now tearing him apart. In a restrained but firm voice, he said, "We need to talk. Soon." Emma looked surprised and uncomfortable, but didn't object. With a nod, she agreed to finish the party and leave. She didn't know what awaited her, but she sensed that something had changed in Thomas, something that perhaps she wasn't yet ready to face. The drive home was silent, an emptiness that seemed to lapse between the two of them. Emma tried to find something to talk about, but each attempt was drowned out by Thomas's indifference. He knew that this night would not end like the others, that the time had come to confront the truth. Tension hung in the air of Thomas and Emma's house as they both walked through the front door, the silence heavier than any words spoken between them. Emma sensed that something was about to happen, but she couldn't imagine the extent of what awaited her. Thomas, on the other hand, felt the weight of a decision he had made, but the intensity of his feelings made it difficult to organize what he would say. He walked into the living room, gesturing for her to follow him. Emma reluctantly sat down in one of the armchairs, her restless gaze searching for some clue in Thomas's closed expressions. Thomas began to speak with a somber calm, each word laden with a pain he could barely control. "I know about you and him, Emma," he said, his voice low, but each syllable seemed to echo through the room, strong enough to fill the space with an unbearable weight. Emma blinked a few times, her lips parted in a mixture of surprise and confusion. "What? What are you talking about?" She tried to keep control, but something in her tone betrayed the nervousness growing inside her. "Don't pretend, Emma. I saw the two of you together tonight," he continued, keeping a calm tone, but his eyes betrayed a mixture of anger and sadness. "The looks, the touches. Don't treat me like an idiot." Emma looked away, an involuntary reflex that gave away more than any words she could say. Thomas noticed, and the pain in his chest intensified. He expected a desperate denial, something to confirm that he was wrong, but her silence only confirmed what he feared. Emma took a deep breath, trying to regain some dignity, and finally replied, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry, Thomas. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." She paused, searching for the words that would soften the blow. "It doesn't mean anything. It was just a moment of weakness." "Weakness?" Thomas repeated bitterly. "How many times has this weakness happened, Emma? How many moments did you decide to hide from me?" The answer didn't come immediately. She lowered her gaze, unable to face him as she struggled to find an answer. His voice became a pained whisper. "I thought I knew you, Emma. I believed that, after all these years, you were the person I would build my future with." She tried to move closer, reaching out to touch him, but he instinctively pulled away, as if her touch was unbearable. "Thomas, listen to me, please. I never wanted you to find out this way. I was confused, it was all a mistake. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Her words came out in a pleading whisper, but Thomas just looked at her with a blank stare, as if each justification was a deeper stab. "And how should it be, Emma?" he asked, with evident bitterness. "Should it be hidden forever? So that I could live a lie while you built a parallel life behind my back?" She shook her head in denial, tears welling up in her eyes. Guilt and despair mingled on her face as she tried to explain the inexplicable, but Thomas was no longer willing to listen. "The truth is, Emma," he continued, his voice cold, "the truth is that I've known for some time. I saw the messages, the looks. And yet I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that I was seeing things where there was nothing." He paused, letting her absorb the weight of what he was saying. "But every day, my trust in you fell apart, and all that was left was the certainty that you were no longer the person I married." She watched him, her eyes misty with tears, but still silent, unable to argue, deny, or justify her actions. He continued, "I thought about confronting you before, giving you a chance to be honest, but, the way you smiled at him tonight, the way you touched him in front of everyone." He stopped, his voice breaking, trying to keep his composure. "It was as if you wanted to humiliate me, Emma. As if I were invisible to you." Emma, in a desperate impulse, got up and went to him, clutching his arms, her voice shaking with tears. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. None of this was meant to hurt you. I was weak, yes, but I still love you. I never wanted our marriage to end. We can get through this. Please, let me try to fix everything. He pushed her away gently but firmly, the pain in his eyes turning into something darker, something resolute. You don't understand, Emma. There's nothing you can do to fix it. His voice was low, but carried a firmness that completely disarmed her. He took a step back, as if he needed distance to process what he was feeling. For years, I've been your partner, your support. And now all I see is someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't value me. Emma fell to her knees, her breathing ragged with despair. She knew she would lose everything, and the prospect of living without him was an emptiness she had never foreseen. Please, Thomas. I don't want to lose you. The words came out between sobs, but Thomas remained firm, his gaze fixed on her, as if he were seeing her for the last time. Thomas watched her, feeling a mixture of pain and release. He had done everything for that marriage, for the life they had built together. But now, it all seemed distant, like a memory he could no longer identify as his own. With nothing more to say, he turned away, walking slowly to the door. She called out to him one last time, but he just looked back and muttered, with an inevitable sadness, "There's nothing left to be saved, Emma." And with those words, he left, leaving her alone with the darkness she herself had created. When the door closed behind Thomas, silence fell like a heavy curtain. The dry sound echoed through the room, and Emma stood motionless, staring at the empty space where he had been moments before. Despair grew inside her like an uncontrollable tide, and for the first time, the scale of what she had done hit her overwhelmingly. She knew that Thomas was the kind of man who gave his soul in a relationship. It was never just about love, but about trust, respect, a bond that she had broken. And now, sitting alone, staring at the echo of her own actions, the reality of the loss suffocated her. Emma stood there, motionless, reliving every detail of the conversation, every look of pain and disappointment he had cast at her. The feeling of regret was eating her up inside, a palpable pain that seemed to settle into every fiber of her being. Why had she done it? That question, plain and simple, tormented her. She had let herself be carried away by a passing adventure, a desire to feel something different in the midst of routine. And now, what had seemed insignificant at the time was turning out to be a devastating mistake. She realized that, for fleeting moments of excitement, she had destroyed something that had taken years to build. The days that followed were a mixture of anguish and emptiness for Emma. She hardly slept, spent sleepless nights mentally revisiting the past, searching for some fragment of happiness that could justify what she had done. But the more she reflected, the more she sank into her own guilt, unable to find any meaning in her choices. The memories of her with Thomas appeared in her mind in painful flashes, the laughter, the trips, the small moments of complicity that now seemed distant, unattainable. It was as if she was trapped in an endless cycle of regret. Meanwhile, Thomas was trying to deal with the internal chaos that Emma's revelation had caused. He took refuge at work, immersing himself in projects and meetings, using the corporate environment as a distraction to drown out his own feelings. But as soon as the workday ended, the pain came back in full force, filling every empty space. He no longer recognized his own home, where everything reminded him of Emma, the paintings she had chosen, the perfume that still permeated some corners. Every object became a cruel reminder of the life they had built together, which now seemed to have been just an illusion. Thomas's friends noticed the change, but he avoided any personal conversation. Always cordial, he kept to himself, not sharing what was going on with anyone. He kept the agony that was slowly consuming him to himself, preferring silence to having to explain the inexplicable. Emma's betrayal had broken something deep inside him, a piece of his own identity that he didn't know how to rebuild. He had always believed in the strength of commitment, in the loyalty that should sustain a relationship. And now, that conviction was crumbling, leaving him with a sense of emptiness and confusion. One evening, after another day in which the silence of the house tormented him, Thomas decided to sit in the room he shared with Emma. He looked at every detail, every scrap of memory he still had, and felt the pain turn into something deeper. He knew he had to move on, but how? How could anyone get over such an intimate, destructive betrayal? He closed his eyes, trying to remember a time when everything was simple, when they loved each other without reservation. But every image was tinged by the current reality, and the happiness he saw in the past seemed more like a distant dream. Emma, for her part, tried everything she could to communicate with Thomas. She sent messages, tried to call, even went to his house on a few occasions, but Thomas remained insurmountable. On one of her visits, she left a letter on the door, explaining her reasons, asking for forgiveness, trying to justify the unjustifiable. She was ready to humble herself, to do anything that would bring some relief to the guilt that consumed her. But her attempt seemed insufficient, as if nothing she said or did would be able to reach Thomas. He had enclosed himself in a wall of silence and resentment, and Emma no longer knew how to break through it. One evening, Emma found the strength to visit Thomas's parents. She knew that sooner or later they would find out, and she wanted to at least try to explain what had happened before the rumors spread. The reception was frosty, the looks of disappointment on her in-laws' faces were painful and revealing. They received her in silence, and she could barely hold back the tears as she tried to explain. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I know there aren't enough excuses, but I want you to know that I loved him and I still love him." It was a moment of weakness that ended everything. Thomas's mother just watched her in silence and, at the end, murmured, "Love shouldn't be something you exchange for a moment of weakness, Emma. My son deserved better." Thomas's mother's words echoed in Emma's mind like a final judgment, a verdict that confirmed the depth of her betrayal. That visit marked the end of her attempts at reconciliation, as she understood that nothing she could do or say would change what had been done. Shame and regret became a constant in her life, and Emma began to live on automatic, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Meanwhile, Thomas felt that, even with the distance, Emma still held some kind of power over him. He couldn't detach himself emotionally from her, and this dilemma consumed him. He wondered if he would ever get over it, if he could ever trust anyone again. The betrayal had not only destroyed their relationship, but also his own view of love and trust. Now, all that remained was the doubt as to whether he could ever truly free himself from that past, from that pain that Emma had left as a scar. And as the days went by, they both faced the consequences of their choices. As time passed, Thomas began to get back on his feet. The intense pain of the betrayal was still with him, but he didn't let it define him. He sought professional help, something that at first seemed unnecessary and even humiliating, but which became essential in order to reorganize the fragments of his life. Therapy helped Thomas understand that, even in the face of such a devastating betrayal, he was still capable of finding new meaning for himself and his experiences. With each session, he was freed from the weight of resentment, understanding that he didn't have to carry the burden of what Emma had done alone. Accepting the pain and learning to let go of the past were the first steps towards finally being able to rebuild his life with a new perspective. Thomas made the decision to move, leaving behind the house where so many memories were trapped. He sold the property, closed the doors to the past and bought an apartment further away, in a neighborhood he had always wanted to explore, but had never had the chance. There, he created a space of his own, an environment that represented him in a fresh way. And although the adaptation process was painful, with memories that haunted him on lonely nights, he allowed himself to start again. Thomas found new hobbies, rediscovered the pleasure of reading and socializing with friends, and little by little, Emma's once omnipresent image faded, giving way to a future he was finally willing to face. Emma, on the other hand, was experiencing the opposite. After her definitive separation and Thomas's rejection, her life entered a cycle of self-criticism and regret. She tried to move on, but guilt and shame haunted her wherever she went. At the company, the situation with her boss became a burden she could no longer bear. What had once seemed exciting was now just a bitter reminder of her wrong choices. Her colleagues, once so receptive, began to treat her with a certain detachment, and Emma soon realized that her personal life had become the subject of whispers and judgments. Her relationship with her boss also began to crumble. He, who at first showed interest, soon lost his admiration and attraction for Emma, seeing her only as a reflection of a mistake they had both made. Without Thomas's support and increasingly isolated, Emma tried to get back on her feet in other ways, but loneliness and the feeling of having betrayed not only her ex-husband, but also herself, made each attempt more difficult than the last. In a moment of reflection, she decided to quit her job. The environment that once seemed familiar and welcoming had become toxic and unbearable. With no direction, Emma sought refuge at her parents' house, hoping to find some kind of comfort, a form of redemption for what she had become. However, her relationship with them had also deteriorated since the betrayal came to light. Silent judgment and disappointment were stamped on every look and every word spoken with a coldness she never imagined she would receive from her own family. The emotional support she so desperately sought was not there, and Emma began to understand the extent of the loneliness her betrayal had condemned her to. Over the next few months, Emma tried to rebuild her life independently, amid the weight of her own mistakes. She began working in a modest position in a small company, a far cry from the prestige she had enjoyed before. There, she found a way to reflect on her actions, on the need to recover what remained of her dignity. The simple routine and the distance from her former life forced her to face her own reality without the distractions of a past that she herself had destroyed. Away from all the privileges and admiring glances that were once commonplace, Emma began to live more humbly, looking for a way to deal with the ghosts of her choices every day. Thomas's fate took a different path. After a long period of self-care and dedication to new activities, he allowed himself to return to social life, reconnecting with friends and family who had always supported him. Not that he was looking for a new relationship, but he allowed himself to meet people, to open up to new experiences without the expectation of finding love again. One of these encounters led him to meet someone with whom he gradually built a genuine friendship, based on mutual respect and understanding. This new friendship brought him renewed hope, a chance to build a life where the past was just a painful chapter, but one he had overcome. For Emma, every day was a battle to come to terms with the void she had left in her life. The months turned into years, and she continued her lonely journey, always reflecting on what she had lost, but still looking for ways to find some peace. She realized, too late, that what she had with Thomas was a rare jewel, a relationship built on solid foundations that she hadn't valued. The reality she had chosen, momentary pleasure, fleeting adventures, had proved too expensive, an illusion that offered her nothing but regret and loneliness. And so they each went their own way, learning from the pain and scars that remained. Thomas moved on, determined not to let the past define his future, while Emma, isolated in her own choices, learned the hard way that betrayal destroys not only the betrayed, but also the betrayer, who carries the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. So, what did you think of this story? Comment below with your opinion and share your thoughts. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now for more intense and impactful stories. And remember, here, we never support any kind of betrayal.